The gavel did not fall with a dramatic crash, it dropped with the dull, greasy thud of a rubber stamp on wet cardboard. Arthur Vance stood behind the mahogany defense rail, his knuckles pressed so hard against the polished wood that the skin over his joints turned the color of skim milk. His ears hummed with a persistent, high-pitched whine, like a distant transformer about to blow. Around him, the federal courtroom smelled faintly of floor wax, damp wool, and the institutional disinfectant that could never quite mask the scent of human panic. On all 12 counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and systematic falsification of corporate accounts, Judge Holloway intoned, her voice flat, devoid of malice or pity, as if she were reading a routine zoning ordinance for municipal parking, this court finds the defendant, Arthur Vance, guilty as charged. The words didn't strike Arthur like a physical blow, they settled over him like wet lead, sinking into the fibers of his charcoal suit, pressing down on his shoulders until his cervical vertebrae ached. 12 counts. 5 years per count, running consecutively or concurrently depending on the federal sentencing guidelines that would be hammered out in 6 weeks. In practical terms, it was a life sentence disguised as a number. At 52 years old, Arthur would walk out of a federal penitentiary an old man, his name a toxic brand, his professional reputation shredded into confetti. He did not look back at the public gallery. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he would see. He would see rows of empty-eyed corporate analysts whispering behind cupped hands, distancing themselves from the contagion of his disgrace. And somewhere in the third row, sitting with his elbows resting comfortably on his knees and a look of profound, sorrowful gravity etched into his handsome, clean-shaven face, would be Julian Cross. Julian, his former protege, the golden boy of Vance and Cross auditing, the brilliant young strategist whom Arthur had personally plucked out of a third-tier business school and mentored for 8 relentless years. Julian, who had systematically siphoned $2.4 million into a shell company in the Cayman Islands while carefully routing every digital signature, every authorized IP log, and every encrypted audit trail through Arthur's private terminal. The defendant is remanded to the custody of the United States Marshal Service pending final sentencing, the judge continued, tapping her pen once against the blotter. Court is adjourned. The deputies moved in with practiced, silent efficiency. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut and a name tag reading Miller, placed a heavy, calloused hand on Arthur's elbow. There was no roughness in the gesture, just the casual, inescapable certainty of iron machinery doing what iron machinery was built to do. "Easy, Mr. Vance," Miller murmured, his tone almost conversational, stripped of any genuine malice. "Let's step through the side hallway." "My briefcase," Arthur said, his voice sounding thin and dry, like dry leaves scraping across asphalt. "The leather one on the table. It contains my personal notes on the Horizon Logistics portfolio." "Leave it," Miller said gently, nudging him toward the side door. "The court takes possession of all material evidence now." "Nothing belongs to you anymore, Arthur." "Nothing belongs to you anymore." The phrase echoed inside Arthur's skull as the heavy oak door swung shut, sealing off the courtroom. They led him through a labyrinth of concrete corridors, past steel-reinforced doors that clicked shut with pneumatic precision, and down into the subterranean processing area of the federal building. For 45 minutes, he stood under the harsh, flickering glare of fluorescent tubes while a board clerk cataloged his possessions: a cracked titanium-framed pair of reading glasses, a worn leather card holder containing expired membership cards to the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, a tarnished silver wedding band that his wife had made him take off 2 years before she filed for divorce, and a crumpled $20 bill. "Sign here," the clerk said, shoving a digital pad across the stainless steel counter. Arthur stared at the little plastic stylus. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion. He signed his name, the looping cursive he had spent 30 years refining on balance sheets and quarterly reports, now looking like the erratic scrawl of a drowning man trying to grab a straw. Because he was a first-time white-collar offender with no history of violence, and because his defense attorney, before abandoning him 3 days ago when the retainer ran dry, had successfully argued for a medical furlough extension pending sentencing. Arthur was released into the autumn afternoon air with instructions to surrender himself to the medium-security correctional facility in Otisville exactly 30 days from today. 30 days. 720 hours. A lifetime packaged into a countdown timer. When the heavy glass doors of the federal courthouse swung outward, a blast of damp, biting wind struck Arthur in the face. A A cold drizzle was beginning to sweep across the concrete plaza, turning the gray pavement the color of wet slate. The late afternoon sky hung low and bruised purple and charcoal over the downtown skyline where the glittering glass towers of Vance and Cross gleamed indifferently against the storm. Arthur pulled the lapels of his raincoat together, his fingers brushing against the inside pocket where the clerk had stuffed his single remaining asset, that $20 bill. It was the only piece of legal tender left in his possession, freed from his wallet because the plastic cards were now deactivated, useless rectangles of PVC. He stepped out onto the wide stone steps, his knees shaking slightly beneath the fabric of his trousers. Down below, the street traffic was a chaotic snarl of yellow cabs, delivery trucks, and commuters hunched under black umbrellas, rushing toward the subway entrances to escape the oncoming chill. And then, sitting against the base of the massive granite pillar to his left, he saw him. The man was huddled beneath a blue tarpaulin remnant that smelled powerfully of damp cardboard and cheap rye whiskey. His hair was a wild tangle of iron-gray wool, matted and unwashed, falling over a face deeply etched with the cartography of a hard, brutal life. A rusted tin coffee can sat on the whetstone between his boots, holding precisely 3 nickels and a copper penny. As Arthur paused, hesitating on the threshold of his ruined life, the man looked up. His eyes were not the watery, vacant eyes of the chronic derelict. They were sharp, dark, and startlingly lucid, a pair of piercing, cynical eyes that seemed to strip away Arthur's expensive, now ruined designer suit and see straight through to the hollowed-out shell beneath. "Don't waste your pity on a church mouse, counselor," the old man croaked, his voice like grinding gravel. "The courthouse sells a much more expensive brand of misery inside. I only deal in discount sorrows." Arthur stopped. He didn't flinch at the word counselor, though he was an auditor, not a lawyer. The public always confused the two in this neighborhood of judges and district attorneys. He looked down at the old man, really looked at him, noticing the way the man's knuckles were scarred and swollen, the way his heavy canvas jacket was patched with duct tape across the elbow. There was something jarringly familiar about the curve of that stubborn jawline, the stubborn tilt of the chin, though it was buried beneath decades of neglect and alcohol-soaked defiance. But Arthur's mind was too numb, too overloaded with the cascading terror of his impending ruin to chase after ghosts in the rain. Without a word, Arthur reached into his coat pocket. His fingers found the crisp, folded rectangle of the $20 bill, the very last bill he owned in the world, the bill that was supposed to buy him a stale sandwich and a cup of black coffee at the all-night diner down on 4th Street to sustain him through his first night of homelessness. He pulled it out. He didn't hesitate. He knelt down on one knee, ignoring the wet grit of the courthouse steps soaking through the fabric of his trousers, and dropped the $20 bill right into the center of the rusted tin can. It landed with a soft, dry flutter against the 3 lonely nickels. The old man stared down at the crisp green bill. His eyebrows drew together, forming a deep, jagged crease between his eyes. He reached out with a trembling, blackened finger, touched the corner of the paper, and then looked back up at Arthur, his dark eyes narrowing into suspicious slits. $20? The old man muttered, his voice dropping an octave, losing its raspy performative edge. "Mister, you look like a man who just had his throat cut from ear to ear in room 3B upstairs. That's your last meal, isn't it?" "My last meal was hours ago, and I lost my appetite," Arthur said softly, his voice steady for the first time all day. He stood back up, swaying slightly against the cold wind. "Keep it. Buy yourself something warm before the freeze sets in tonight." He turned his back on the courthouse steps and began walking down toward the subway entrance, his head bowed against the rain, leaving the old man sitting in the gray mist with a $20 bill that bore a tiny, accidental ink smudge right over the portrait of Andrew Jackson, a smudge shaped exactly like a broken key. Behind him, on the stone steps, Thomas Cross stared at the retreating figure of the man who had just handed him his entire worldly wealth, a cold, dangerous realization slowly igniting in the dark corners of his ruined mind. The heater in room 14 of the Azure Motel didn't so much blow warm air as cough up a rhythmic, bronchial rattle that smelled of scorched dust and ancient rust. Arthur sat at the edge of the sagging double bed, his unbuttoned raincoat hanging heavily from his shoulders. The room was illuminated only by the harsh, electric blue pulse of a flashing neon sign outside *vacancy*, which blinked through the cracked vinyl blinds every 3 seconds, painting the peeling floral wallpaper in alternating shades of sickly turquoise and shadow. His phone lay on the speckled Formica nightstand. It was a sleek smartphone, but right now it was nothing more than a dead brick of glass and aluminum. 34 missed calls. Not a single one of them was an inquiry of support. They were all automated alerts from credit card companies, foreclosure warnings from his mortgage lender, and angry voice messages from former clients hastily severing ties with Vance and cross-auditing. When Arthur had tried calling Marcus Vance, his older brother, a cautious suburban pediatrician, the phone had rung twice before going straight to a pre-recorded message. The subscriber you have dialed is not accepting calls from this number. Family, it turned out, was just another asset that depreciated rapidly when liquidation proceedings began. Arthur closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his palms against his throbbing temples. His briefcase was gone, confiscated by the federal court as material evidence. But human memory, sharpened by 30 years of forensic accounting, was a stubborn vault. He could still see every single entry of the Horizon Logistics ledger in his mind's eye, the fractional discrepancies in the overseas tax filings, the clever routing numbers through the shell corporations in the Bahamas, and, most damning of all, the digital authorization keys that bore his own login credentials. Julian had been brilliant. That was the bitterest pill of all. Julian hadn't just hacked Arthur's terminal, he had studied Arthur's digital habits, his typing rhythm, and even his weekend hours, systematically building a virtual ghost that walked, breathed, and embezzled in Arthur's name. He left me no margin, Arthur whispered into the damp silence of the motel room. His voice sounded hollow, like gravel sliding down a dry pipe. Not even a decimal point of escape. He stood up, his joints popping in the chill air, and walked over to the small window. Through the crack in the blinds, he looked down at his car, a battered 2012 Honda Civic parked right beneath the flickering neon sign. He had managed to drive it here before his bank accounts were frozen, using the last 5 gallons of gas in the tank. Inside the glove compartment, tucked beneath a stack of expired service manuals, was an old, leather-bound notebook, his analog journal from his early years at the firm, containing handwritten notes on old client portfolios, including some of Julian's earliest, unpolished training exercises. If there was any genetic fingerprint of Julian's deception, any stubborn habit of calculation that the young prodigy had carried over from his university days, it would be in those handwritten margins. Arthur reached for his raincoat, intending to brave the cold drizzle and retrieve the notebook from the car. Before his fingers could graze the fabric, a sharp, metallic knock shattered the silence of the room. Rap, rap, rap. Arthur froze. His heart slammed violently against his ribs, a sudden surge of adrenaline tightening every muscle in his body. In his current state of social exile, a knock on a motel door at 11 o'clock at night didn't bring room service or friendly visitors. It brought process servers, debt collectors, or worse, the quiet, heavy-handed enforcers of a system that wasn't willing to wait 30 days for him to report to Otisville. He didn't move. The neon sign flashed blue, dark blue. "I know you're in there, counselor," a raspy, gravel-laced voice called out from the other side of the thin wooden door. The lights flickering through the bottom gap like a lighthouse guiding a sinking ship. "Open up before I freeze my remaining toes off." Arthur's breath caught. He recognized that voice instantly. It was the same abrasive, cynical timbre that had bounced off the granite pillars of the federal courthouse hours earlier. The old man from the steps. The beggar. Slowly, cautiously, Arthur stepped across the stained carpet and turned the deadbolt. He pulled the door open a mere 6 inches, his chain lock holding firm, peering out into the dim, shadowy breezeway where the cold rain was blowing in sheets. Standing under the flickering yellow bulb of the hallway light was Thomas Cross. Up close, away from the gray mist of the courthouse plaza, the old man looked even more weathered. His canvas jacket was soaked through, plastered against his thin, angular frame. But his dark eyes were burning with an intense, unsettling clarity. In his right hand, pinched between 2 blackened, calloused fingers, was a crisp green rectangle. It was the $20 bill Arthur had dropped into his tin can 4 hours ago. "You left your calling card, counselor," Thomas said, his lips curling into a dry, humorless smirk. He held the bill up, letting the sickly neon light wash over it. "And being an accountant by trade, I figured I ought to return a discrepancy of this magnitude. $20 is a lot of money in my neighborhood. In yours, I imagine it's just loose change used to tip the parking attendant. How did you find me?" Arthur asked, his voice tight with bewilderment and defensive caution. He didn't open the door any further. "This motel is 20 miles from downtown. There are 1,000 places I could have gone. I spent 40 years tracking down missing corporate assets across 3 continents before the bottle ate my liver and my license, Thomas rasped, shifting his weight onto his sore ankle. You drove a silver Civic with a dented rear bumper and a missing fuel cap, heading west on Route 4. It's not rocket science, Vance. Besides, I read the evening news on the lobby television downstairs. Disgraced auditor sentenced in multi-million-dollar fraud. Your name was flashing in bright yellow letters right underneath a very handsome photograph of my least favorite human being on God's green earth. Arthur's eyes narrowed. A sudden, cold shiver ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the motel's broken heater. My least favorite human being. What did you say? Arthur whispered. Thomas let out a short, bark-like laugh that ended in a rattling cough. He reached up, shoved the heavy, matted tangle of gray hair away from his forehead, and stared straight into Arthur's eyes with a fierce, terrifying intensity. I said, Thomas muttered, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl, that the boy whose face is plastered all over the financial news networks, the brilliant, untouchable junior partner of Vance and Cross, happens to carry my blood. My name is Thomas Cross. And that greasy, well-tailored sneak you're taking the fall for, is my estranged son, Julian. The words hung in the damp motel air, heavy and explosive, like a live grenade tossed onto the threadbare carpet. Arthur stared at the old man, his mind grinding to a violent halt as decades of corporate lore, whispered rumors, and carefully guarded firm secrets suddenly collided in a blinding flash of realization. Julian had always claimed he was an orphan from upstate, a self-made prodigy with no family background to speak of. And now, here stood the broken, alcoholic ghost of his father, holding a crumpled $20 bill marked with a smudge like a broken key. Come inside, Arthur said, his voice dropping all pretense of caution as he unlatched the chain and swung the door wide open. Before you freeze to death. The gray light of dawn did little to soften the cheap, stained carpet of room 14. Arthur sat cross-legged on the mattress, his eyes bloodshot and burning from a sleepless night. Spread out before him on the small formica table were a dozen hotel napkins covered in sharp, frantic mathematical equations, arrows, and encrypted routing codes. Opposite him, Thomas sat nursing a stale cup of black coffee that Arthur had bought from the vending machine down the hall. The old man hadn't touched the coffee much, instead, his calloused thumb rhythmically stroked the corner of the crumpled $20 bill lying flat between them. You're looking at it like a standard corporate audit, Vance, Thomas rasped, his voice rough with morning phlegm. He took a slow, deliberate breath. That's your blind spot. You think Julian is a creature of spreadsheets and federal compliance regulations. He isn't. Julian is a creature of pure, unadulterated terror. Arthur looked up from a cluster of Cayman Island Shell Company tax IDs, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his sweat-slicked nose. Terror? The man just successfully framed his mentor and secured a multi-million-dollar corporate promotion without batting an eye. That's not terror, that's cold, calculated sociopathy. Call it what you want, Thomas muttered, his dark eyes flashing with a bitter, vindictive light. When Julian was 12 years old, I lost everything to a bad real estate bet and a worse addiction. I used to lock him in the basement of our old house in Albany for 12 hours at a time while I went looking for a bottle. I didn't want him running into my creditors. You know what he did down there in the dark? He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He sat in the corner with an old accounting ledger I brought home from a failed diner, and he taught himself double-entry bookkeeping by flashlight. Thomas tapped a scarred finger against the table, right over the ink smudge shaped like a broken key. Julian doesn't just steal money, Arthur. He hoards control because he's terrified of ever being locked in that basement again. Every single shell company he creates, every single offshore routing number follows a strict numerical sequence based on the dates of his mother's death and that old house in Albany. It's his secret signature. It's his digital umbilical cord. Arthur stared at the old man, a cold wave of realization washing over him. The pieces of the puzzle, pieces that had seemed impossibly complex and random during the federal trial, suddenly snapped together with the terrifying precision of a falling guillotine. During the audit of Horizon Logistics, Julian hadn't just used random encrypted nodes. He had used a recursive algorithm based on a prime number sequence that matched the street numbers of Albany's industrial district. Because Arthur had trusted Julian as his protege, he had never cross-referenced Julian's personal legacy data against the firm's master security logs. He left his own fingerprint inside the code, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and rising fury. Not a physical fingerprint, a psychological one. If I extract the raw server logs from the firm's legacy database using this exact prime number filter. You won't just prove your innocence, Thomas interrupted, leaning forward so sharply that the chair legs screeched against the floorboards. You'll expose the fact that every single dollar Julian allegedly framed you for is sitting in a private, unencrypted contingency vault linked to his personal social security number at the Albany Savings Bank. A vault he opened 6 months before you ever hired him. Arthur grabbed a pen. His hand no longer shook. The exhaustion that had weighed him down like wet lead was instantly incinerated by a sharp, crystalline surge of adrenaline. We don't have court access, and the federal judge won't hear a motion for 30 days, Arthur said rapidly, his eyes darting across the napkin notes. If we file a formal motion, Julian's legal team will bury it under injunctions before the weekend. We need to strike directly. We need to force his hand right now, while he's still high on his own victory. Thomas let out a short, dry chuckle, standing up and buttoning his soaked, duct-taped canvas jacket. Who said anything about filing a motion? Thomas said, his lips curling into a feral grin. A formal motion is for gentlemen, Arthur. We're dealing with a cornered rat who grew up in my basement. You stay here, crunch these numbers into a clean flash drive, and get ready. I'm going to go pay a little family visit to my dear, successful son. Before Arthur could protest, Thomas turned on his heel, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the bright, indifferent morning sunlight. 2 hours later, the towering glass-and-steel monolith of Vance and Cross Auditing stood gleaming against the autumn sky like an indifferent monument to corporate wealth. Inside the executive lobby on the 42nd floor, the atmosphere was pristine, smelling faintly of imported white lilies, fresh espresso, and polished marble. Receptionists in immaculate gray tailored suits sat behind curved desks of brushed titanium, efficiently managing the constant flow of high-paying clients, investors, and junior analysts. When the elevator doors chimed and Thomas Cross stepped out onto the 42nd floor, the pristine silence of the lobby stuttered. He looked entirely out of place, a walking hurricane of frayed canvas, unwashed hair, and sour whiskey breath moving through a temple of corporate sanctity. 2 private security guards in sharp navy blue blazers immediately detached themselves from the corner pillar, their strides purposeful and cold. "Excuse me, sir," the taller guard said, stepping directly into Thomas's path, his hand hovering near his belt. "This is a private corporate floor. Do you have an appointment, or are you looking for the public shelter down on 10th Avenue? Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the guard. His dark, piercing eyes were fixed entirely on the double glass doors at the end of the long corridor, the frosted glass doors that bore the freshly engraved gold lettering, Julian Cross, Managing Partner. "Tell Julian that his father is here," Thomas said, his voice carrying a raspy, authoritative weight that made the guard hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Tell him that the man from the basement has come to collect his dividend." "Sir, I'm going to ask you to turn around right now, or we're going to physically escort you down to the loading dock," the guard snapped, stepping closer and reaching out to grab Thomas's shoulder. "Touch me, and I'll scream so loud about whose blood is really funding this marble floor that the SEC will be up here before you can finish your lunch," Thomas snarled, his eyes flaring with such unhinged, concentrated fury that the guard's hand froze mid-air. Before security could escalate the situation, the heavy glass doors at the end of the corridor swung open. Julian Cross stepped out into the hallway, holding a leather portfolio under one arm, looking impeccably groomed in a custom-tailored charcoal brioni suit, a lavender silk tie, and a brilliant, self-assured smile directed at a junior associate walking beside him. Julian stopped mid-sentence as his eyes scanned the lobby and landed on the ragged, familiar figure standing near the elevators. The color drained from Julian's handsome face with terrifying speed. The polished, effortless smile froze, then cracked, like a pane of fine crystal struck by a hammer. For 3 endless seconds, the high-flying, untouchable junior partner of Vance and Cross looked less like a financial titan and more like a terrified 12-year-old boy cowering in a dark basement. "Julian," Thomas called out, his voice cutting through the silent lobby like a butcher's knife. He reached slowly into his canvas pocket, pulled out the crumpled, ink-stained $20 bill, and tossed it across the gleaming marble floor. It skidded smoothly past the reception desk, spinning to a halt right at the polished leather shoes of the managing partner. "You dropped your change, son," Thomas said softly, the silence in the room pressing down like a physical weight. "And I think it's time you started paying your debts." The $20 bill lay on the polished Italian marble, its tiny ink smudge shaped like a broken key catching the cold, direct glare of the ceiling spotlights. Julian's chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow spasms. For a terrifying, breathless second, the immaculate junior partner of Vance and Cross looked as though he might lunge forward and tear the paper to shreds. The junior associate standing beside him shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Julian's pale, sweat-beaded forehead and the ragged old man standing by the elevator. "Get him out of here," Julian managed to choke out, his voice cracking slightly on the final syllable. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Thomas. "Security! Drag this vagrant off the floor right now, or I'll have every man in this building fired before the bell rings." The two security guards moved forward, but before their hands could touch Thomas's canvas jacket, a sharp, metallic chime echoed from the executive assistant's desk phone. Then another chime. And another. Within 3 seconds, every desktop terminal and emergency compliance screen on the 42nd floor began to flash with a harsh, crimson warning light. "System alert, master node encryption override. Incoming data packet, forensic audit trail, Horizon Logistics shell accounts. Origin, unverified external IP/federal compliance relay." Julian whipped his head around toward the master terminal. His eyes widened in absolute horror as lines of code scrolled across the monitor, lines containing the exact prime number sequences, the Albany street number algorithms, and the personal social security backup vault that he had locked away 6 months before Arthur was ever brought into the firm. "What is this?" the junior associate whispered, stepping back as if Julian had suddenly caught fire. "Julian, those are your personal routing keys. Why is the federal compliance server pulling your private backup?" Because at that exact minute, sitting down at the Formica table in room 14 of the Azure Motel, Arthur had pressed send. He hadn't just forwarded the files to the compliance department, he had triggered an automated data dump directly into the open investigative portal of the United States District Attorney's Office, attaching a signed, time-stamped affidavit detailing every single step of the frame-up. Thomas didn't flinch as the security guards finally reached him. He simply looked down at his son, at the tailored Brioni suit, the expensive silk tie, and the hollow, shivering shell of a man trapped inside them. "You can lock the basement door all you want, Julian," Thomas said softly, his voice cutting cleanly through the frantic hum of the flashing servers. "You can hide behind glass towers and million-dollar salaries. But a debt written in blood and fear always comes due. Your mentor didn't steal your future, son. Your own shadow did." The elevator doors slid open behind Thomas. 2 federal marshals, the very same men who had processed Arthur the day before, stepped out onto the marble floor, their expressions grim and definitive. They didn't look at Thomas. They looked straight past him, marching directly toward the center of the executive suite. "Julian Cross," the lead marshal said, his voice flat and unyielding as he reached inside his coat. "You're coming with us." 3 weeks later, the autumn drizzle had given way to a crisp, brilliant October morning. The federal courthouse steps, which had felt like a descent into the underworld on that bleak Friday afternoon, were now washed clean by the morning sun. Pigeons fluttered across the granite plaza, pecking at crumbs left behind by early commuters rushing toward the subway. Arthur Vance walked down those steps in a comfortable, charcoal tweed jacket, not the designer suit that had been ruined by the rain, but a simpler, sturdier coat he had worn years ago when he was just an ambitious mid-level accountant who still believed in the quiet poetry of a balanced ledger. His briefcase was back in his hand, his own leather case, returned by the federal prosecutor's office alongside a formal letter of exoneration. The charges against him had been dropped with a quiet, humiliated public apology from the executive board of Vance and Cross. Julian was currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting trial, his financial empire dissolving into dust as forensic accountants systematically unraveled every shell company he had ever touched. As Arthur reached the bottom of the steps, he paused near the base of the massive granite pillar where it had all begun. Sitting against the stone, wrapped in the same patched canvas jacket, was Thomas. A fresh, clean tin coffee can sat on the pavement between his boots. Next to it rested a heavy, insulated thermos and a brown paper bag from the bakery down the street. Arthur walked over, stepped lightly, and sat down right on the cold stone beside the old man, letting his knees bend against the chill. He didn't say a word. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a crisp, brand new $20 bill, and laid it gently across the top of the tin can. Thomas looked down at the bill. A slow, tired smile crept across his weathered, bristly face. He picked it up, turned it over, and tucked it carefully inside his inner pocket. "You know, counselor," Thomas rasped, his voice as dry as autumn leaves, "for a man who supposedly understands numbers, you're terrible at economics. You keep handing out your last $20 to total strangers on the street." Arthur smiled, pulling a cardboard cup of black coffee from his bag and handing it to the old man. "It's not an expense, Thomas," Arthur said, his eyes resting on the bright, bustling morning traffic streaming past the courthouse plaza. "It's an investment. Some assets appreciate in ways the balance sheets can never quite measure." Thomas took the coffee, let out a deep, rumbling sigh of satisfaction, and leaned his head back against the warm stone of the pillar. Beside him, the former prisoner and the forgotten father sat in comfortable silence, watching the city move forward under a sky that was finally, completely clear.